Masechet Yevamot Daf Mem Vav. The topic today is conversion to Judaism and also how to acquire a non-Jewish slave. Both topics, what they have in common is that both ceremonies require immersion in a mikveh. We ended the daf yesterday by noting that sometimes immersion in a mikveh can be ambiguous. We saw a case of a woman who immersed because of nidah reasons, even though she wasn't Jewish. And afterwards, the rabbi came and said, "Oh, since you immersed for nidah, we can count that for conversion as well." Or a man who went to the mikveh because he was Baal Keri, and then the rabbi said, "You know what? We can count that for conversion as well, even though that's not what you initially had in mind." All right, so now that we see the overlap between these two topics, let's see the halacha. Amar Rav Hama bar Guria Amar Rav. In the name of Rav, we have a law. Halokech aebed min hagoy kadam v'tavah l'shem ben chorin kana asmo ben chorin. Someone who acquires, a Jew who acquires a slave from a non-Jew. So this he's required to go to the mikveh because he's going to be part of the Jew's household. As part of the Jew's household, he has to observe mitzvot like a woman would. The idea is that everyone in a Jew's household should be within the boundaries of Torah law. So he doesn't become a Jew. This is not a conversion process, but he has to go to the mikveh to become an official Eved Kena'ani. And now here's the thing. This slave, he knows his stuff. He went and jumped into the mikveh, and he had in mind, I'm doing this as conversion to Judaism. Kanatzmo ben Horin, it works. So he actually then becomes a Jew and therefore goes free. He can't be an Eved Kena'ani because he just immersed for the sake of conversion to Judaism, and he is therefore for a full Jew. So very interesting law. Mai ta'ama, what is the reason for it? Goy gufa la kanile, mai de kanile hu de maknele de Israel, vekevan de kadam vetava l'shem ben chorin af ka'e l'shibudeh. So here's the interesting law. We're going to see the source for it in a minute. The law is that a Jew can own the body of a non-Jewish slave. However, a non-Jew does not own the body of a non-Jewish slave, but only the right to his work. He only has a lien on his an ownership of his whatever he produces. This is, in Roman law, non-Jews, Romans can own other people. So certainly ownership in Roman law, but halakha does not recognize non-Jewish ownership of a non-Jew, only the Jewish ownership of a non-Jew. Okay, so what does that mean? So therefore, this non-Jew who was an owner of a non-Jewish slave did not actually own the body of the slave, but only the right to his labor. And therefore, when the non-Jewish owner sells that right to a Jew, the Jew is only acquiring the right to his labor, not the body of the non-Jew. Therefore, once the non-Jew goes to the mikveh, then the Jew owns his body as well, and then he's totally not free. A Jew totally controls him. So here, where the non-Jewish owner delivers the non-Jewish slave, he's really only delivering the rights to his labor. So therefore, this non-Jewish slave, he still has a right, he still owns his own body. Therefore, when he goes to the mikveh and he has in mind, I'm doing this because I want to convert to Judaism, it works. And the non-Jewish, and the Jewish owner, we'll see if he can do anything to prevent this. But if he doesn't do anything to prevent that, then it works. So that's the idea, right? Goy, non-Jew, does not own the body, the gufa of the non-Jewish slave, and so whatever he owns, whatever the non-Jewish owner owns, is what he is delivering to the Jew. So the Jew is only at that point has bought only the labor of this slave, and since the slave went and did tevilah to become free, to become a Jew, so that lien is now gone because now he's fully a Jew. All this follows the opinion of Rava. Kid Rava Amar Rava Hekdesh Hametz v'shichrur mafki'in mideh shi'bud. Rava says, in general, let's say I owe someone money and that person takes a lien on my property. If they don't own the property, it's only a lien on the property, and so I own it until such point as I default on the loan, and then he comes to collect it. But he has a lien from now. I can get out of the lien. How? Let's say he has a lien on a sheep that I have, and I say this sheep is hekdesh. I'm going to make it a korban on the mizbeach. Well, now it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the Bet HaMikdash, and then that lien that my creditor had goes away, he loses it. Or if I said, okay, I owe you money, and here you have a lien on my hametz, on this piece of bread in front of me, and then Pesach starts, and when Pesach starts, so the hametz is prohibited, I'm not allowed to own it, and therefore I have to destroy it, it becomes not mine, it's batel, and therefore he doesn't have a lien on it because I don't own it anymore. And similarly, if I owe someone money, and I say, hey, listen, you have a lien on my slave, and then so then we go on, and then I free the slave. So once I free the slave goes free. It's not owned by me, and therefore cannot be owned by my creditor either. So these are three ways that Rava says mafki'in mideh shibud. So once a slave is freed, once his body is freed, so too the lien on him is freed, and therefore that we apply that also in this case. Once this non-Jewish slave that the Jew bought goes to the mikveh, and now he owns his body. He goes to the mikveh. Now he's a Jew, and he's free. Being free means he also releases himself from the lien that was upon him. Rambam adds here that this non-Jewish slave that now used this trick and became Jewish still owes the owner, now his Jewish owner who bought him, he owes him the price because he made himself free, but there's still a monetary obligation to pay for his freedom. Okay, this is very interesting. There is a parallel to this in Roman law. Gaius, who was a Roman legal scholar and writer in the 2nd century CE, a little bit before the time of the Mishnah, wrote a textbook of Roman law in which he writes a manumission made with a view, meaning a process by which a slave is freed by the owner, made with a view to defraud creditors. Right, the owner is only freeing the slave in order to release the lien from his creditor or patron is void. So according to Roman law, this does not work. The liberation is prevented by this certain law. So you see, in Roman law, this would not work, but Rava does not agree with the Roman law and says, yes, it works. I can free my slave, and my creditor will therefore lose out on his lien. All right, now we have a challenge to this law. Mativ Rav Chisda, Maaseh bebeloria hagiyoret. There was a case regarding a woman named Valerie, the convert. Valerie was a well-known, a wealthy family in Rome who converted to Judaism, and she owned many non-Jewish slaves at the same time, and she wanted to then bring them with her to become official halachic avadim kena'anim. Shekadmu avadeha v'tavlu lefaneha. However, they did it in the wrong order. First, she was supposed to become a convert, then she would be Jewish, and then she can acquire those non-Jews as official Eved Kanani when they would go to the mikveh afterwards. But in this case, the slaves went and did Tevilah before she did. So now they're becoming Eved Kanani, but they don't have an owner. So they don't have a Jewish owner. And the sages looked into it and they said, since they went first, so they acquired themselves by going to the mikveh. Now they became Jewish, and now that they're Jewish, they are free, they own their own bodies, and then they own their own labor as well. So we see here that lefaneha in, lahareha lo. The only reason that they acquired their freedom is because they went first. and went to the mikveh before their owner. But if it was the other way around, if she had gone to the mikveh and then was Jewish, and then they came and they went to the mikveh, then they would not acquire themselves, even if that's what they had in mind. And so this contradicts the law that we saw just now that says if a non-Jewish, if a Jew, he's already a Jew, acquires a non-Jewish slave, and the non-Jewish slave goes to the mikveh with intention to become Jewish as conversion, then he goes free. But in this story, it would not be so. So what's the solution? Amar Rava lefaneha ben bistam ben bimforash lachare bimforash in bistam lo. Rava says, I can reconcile this. If the non-Jewish slaves goes before her, before the Jew does, like in the case of this Valerie, then whether they say so explicitly or whether they don't say anything, we can assume that they went to the mikveh for conversion to Judaism, because after all, since there's no Jewish owner that's acquiring them, because she went to the mikveh afterwards, so then why are they going to the mikveh? So then it can be assumed, even if it's not said explicitly, that it is for conversion and they go free. However, la hareha, if they go after her, which is the same as our case where the Jew is already a Jew and he's acquiring a non-Jewish slave, then bimforashin bistam lo. Then the non-Jewish slave has to say explicitly, I am going to the mikveh in order to become Jewish, and jumps in before anyone can stop him. Then yes, indeed, that is the law, and so that upholds the law. But if he doesn't say anything, and some say the word lefaneh is not before or after, but in front of the owner, right? So there you have the owner right there in front of the mikveh watching. And it's clear, if unless the slave says otherwise, it would be assumed that they are converting because they were just acquired and they're going to the mikveh to become an eved kena'ani. Okay, so that is the difference between the cases. Next, Amar Rav Avya. Rav Avya is going to teach another halacha. Lo shanu ela belokeach min hagoy, aval goy gufeh kaneh. He's limiting what we just said. And said this is only true when a Jew acquires a slave from a non-Jew. Since the non-Jew only owns the labor of the slave, and therefore the Jew only acquires the labor of the slave until after the mikveh, and so therefore the slave can jump in and free himself by declaring that he is dunking in order to become Jewish. But if the non-Jew himself decides to sell himself into slavery, since he owns his own body and his labor, therefore that non-Jew would be giving over himself fully to the Jew, and therefore if he went to the mikveh, then that would we assume that is only to become an Eved Kanani, because he does have a right to sell himself into slavery, even his body. How do we know that? Dichtiv וגם מבני התושבים הגרים עמכם מהם תקנו. אתם קונים מהם, ולא הם קונים מכם, ולא הם קונים זה מזה. So these Pesukim in Vayikra, right before that, it was talked about the laws of Eved Ivri, a Jew owning a Jew. And now it talks about a Jew owning a non-Jew, and it says, "Abdecha v'amatecha shiu lach me'et hagoyim meshivotechem mehem tiknu eved v'ama." If you have a male or female servant from other nations, וגם מבני התושבים המגרים מהם תקנו משפחתם אשר עמכם. You can also acquire from either other countries or even foreigners who live in Israel among you. אשר בעשיכם והיו לכם לאחוזה, and you own them as property. So what do we learn from here? That you, a Jew, can own a non-Jew, But they, lohem konim mikem, they, a non-Jew, cannot own a Jew, velohem konim ze mizeh, and non-Jews cannot acquire each other. A non-Jew cannot own a non-Jew, and from the perspective of Jewish law. So therefore, this is the explanation why if a non-Jewish owner sells a slave to a Jew, then he can preempt, the slave can preempt and make himself a convert, but not if he sells himself into slavery. Okay, so we're going to prove that the pasuk must mean that. Velo hem konim mikem lemai, when it says that they cannot own a Jew, what does that mean? If you're talking about only for the rights of labor, so is that true that a non-Jew cannot acquire a Jew for his labor? They certainly can. The continuation of those Pesukim that we just saw talk about that very case of a non-Jew who acquires a Jew. It says, yad ger v'toshav imach, if this resident alien among you prospers, meaning this non-Jew among you becomes rich, and your brother, umach achi chaimo, and your brother, the Jew, becomes poor, v'nimka ger toshav imach, ole kemishpachat ger, and he is sold as a slave to the ger toshav, or the family, eker mishpachat ger, or the offshoot of an alien's family. So who is that? They are non-Jews, and they own a Jew. So certainly a non-Jew can own a Jew, at least for Maaseh Yadav, right? V'amamo mishpachat ger, ze goy, the family of the ger, is not Jewish. Elalav legufeh, v'kamadachamana atem konim mehem afilu gufeh. Rather, the context shows that it must be referring to, right, when it says, since it says a non-Jew cannot own a Jew, well, that is not talking about his labor, it's talking about his body. A non-Jew cannot own a Jew in body. But then, so the rest of the derivation that a Jew can own a non-Jew, obviously that means for his body. And the Torah says, "Atem konim mehem," a Jew can own a non-Jew, even his body. Okay, so that's how we learn that the difference between Jewish ownership and non-Jewish ownership of a slave, and that is why the non-Jew can give himself over into slavery and not convert, but the non-Jew who sells a non-Jew to a Jew, in that case the slave can preempt and convert himself by dunking. Good. Parich Rav Acha, Ema bekaspa ubitzbila. Hold on. Even in the case of a non-Jew selling himself into slavery, it's not necessarily true that he cannot then go to the mikveh, because maybe only bekaspa ubitbila. Perhaps when the pasuk said that a Jew can own a non-Jew, that is only after he both pays for the slave and the slave goes to the mikveh. But even if a slave sold himself into slavery, and so he can sell his body, he owns his body, and nevertheless the Jew does not acquire the body of the slave until he both pays and he goes to the mikveh, and therefore Rav Avya does not have a proof. Perhaps the non-Jew can sell himself, and the payment will go to wherever it goes. Maybe he had some debt that it goes to, but this non-Jew can then still go to the mikveh for conversion to Judaism, and that would work because the Jewish owner does not yet acquire his body until after the tevilah, and so there's no proof for Rav Avya, and this is kashya. We leave this as a difficulty. The halacha does follow his law, even though the proof that he brings is not an absolute proof. All right, now that we saw this law regarding a Jew who acquires a non-Jewish slave from a non-Jew, that the non-Jew can go and go into the mikveh as a convert. So now we want to try to figure out what it would be a procedure by which the Jewish owner can prevent the non-Jewish slave from doing this. So here is one. If you want to ensure that the slave does not go into the mikveh with intention to convert, then he can hold him under the water, and that shows his dominance over the slave, and he is therefore doing it only as a slave and not as a free person. So that would be One way of doing that. Ki hayde minyamin abdeh de Rav Asher be'al atbule mesare nihalayhu rabina ravacha bere de Rava amalu chazude minaychu kaba'it le. So the example would be Minyamin, the slave of Rav Asher, who he wanted to immerse him. Rav Asher wanted to immerse him so that he would become a full Eved Kena'ani. And so he appointed Ravina Ravacha, says, listen, can you go and take this Minyamin and dunk him? And listen, he told them, you better do a good job. Otherwise, I'm going to claim a compensation from you for him. If you let him go to the mikveh as a convert and I lose him out as a slave, you have to pay me his value. So they really want to make sure that they do a good job. Ramule ad visa besavare ad pule vesimsemule. Okay, this is a bit difficult to even read, but we have to put this in the context of Roman society where these things were just part of the regular economy. So they placed a rope around, these two rabbis placed a rope around Minyamin's neck, and they loosened it, and then they tightened it again while he was dunking. Why did they do that? They loosened it because they don't want it to be an interposition between his skin and the water, so it had to be a little bit loose. But they quickly tightened it again so he couldn't say, oh, I'm going to the mikveh so I can be a free man, by having a noose around his neck. That is a very dramatic and clear indication that he is not a free man. He is only going to the mikveh to become an Eved Kena'ani. And as soon as he lifted his head from the water, they gave him a bucket full of cement and said, put it on your head and carry it back to your master. Right, go back to Rav Asher. Not that this was absolutely necessary, but a demonstration that they did a good job and they made sure he is subservient. So this is a very, very dramatic scene here, and a way that they did ensure that the slave would not use this loophole and acquire his own freedom. Amar le Rav Papa le Rava, Hazi mor hane debe Papa bar abad yavi zuzel enashe lechargaihu meshabedi behu. So Rav Papa told Rava, look at these. Have you seen, right, the house of Papa bar Abba? He was a very, very wealthy person, and if there was someone who could not pay the poll tax, every single person had to pay tax for their head, and if he saw someone who was poor and could not pay, this Papa bar Abba would pay for them, would pay their poll tax. Mishabedu behu. But by doing that, they weren't just doing it out of charity, they also acquired that person, the poor person, as a slave, right? This is in compensation, right? Because otherwise, these people would be taken by the government. If you don't pay your poll tax, then the government takes you away. And so instead it says, listen, I'll pay it, and then I'll acquire the right to the person. So here's the question. When, let's assume that they're not Jewish, all right? So when Papa bar Abba, he acquired these slaves, now at some point they go free, right? They'll work for as long as it would take them to pay off this debt. Let's say the poll tax was $1,000, so they'll work for a few days until they can make up $1,000, and then they go free. When they go free, do they need a bill of emancipation? In other words, did he acquire their bodies officially like a slave? And therefore they need a get, or no, maybe he just acquired their labor. So it was a kind of forced labor for that time, but then they can go free without a get because it's not official ownership. That is the question. And he answered, Amar le iku shechivi la amri lechu ha mileta. So Rava said, it's a good thing that you asked me this now. Yeah, because if I had died, I would not have been able to tell it to you. In other words, this subject matter never came up in our regular learning, but I do have a tradition about it. And if you hadn't asked me while I was alive, then it would be lost. Which is just an amazing statement by itself. That because of the oral, because the law was Ba'al Peh, so whatever was transmitted to the student would continue to be transmitted, but many things must have been lost. Because they just never came up in their classes. So he says, here's the law that I learned. Hachi amarav sheshat mo har kaihu dehane betafsa de malka manach umalka marman de la yahiv karga mishtabad leman de yahib karga. And so he explained that the writ of slavery of the residents of a kingdom all belong to the king. They're all deposited in the king's treasury. In other words, a king, this was the form of government. A king actually owns this whole country. He owns as slaves all of the citizens of his country, especially those who didn't pay their poll tax. So everyone has a lien to the king. And the king actually owns the bodies of everyone in his country, right? It's amazing. It's hard to imagine this living in a modern democracy. But that is the law. And the king said, Man de la yahiv karga, whoever doesn't pay the poll tax will become a slave to one, mishtabad de man de yahiv karga, will be a slave to one who pays the poll tax on their behalf. And therefore, we have a concept, dina de malchuta dina, the law of the land is recognized within halakha as well. And if the king says that, hey, if you pay for this guy, then you acquire his body, then that is the case. And therefore, when Papa Bar Abba would pay for the poll tax of these poor people, he would acquire their bodies, and after the time that they paid for with their labor, they would go free, and they would require a written statement of emancipation. All right, this is super interesting, and also this concept of dina de malchuta dina is actually very important here regarding a general concept of Eved Kana'ani. And what does that mean? Why does an Eved Kana'ani become a Jew when he is freed? If you look in the Torah, Tanakh doesn't say anything about that. It has a concept of Eved Kana'ani that is owned by the Jew and even generations, and they don't go free unless they can go free if they knock out their eye and their tooth, or if he wants to free them. But from the Torah, it sounds like once they're freed, they go back to becoming Eved Kana'ani. So where do we find such a concept that they would actually become Jewish? Interestingly, in Roman law, it's in the same legal code that Gaius wrote, that I read from before. It says that in Roman law, if a Roman acquires a non-Roman as a slave, a Roman citizen acquires from a foreign country that they conquered or that was sold to them, so then they are a slave. Owned as property, owns their body. However, if the owner decides to free the slave, maybe after a long time of good service, as act of goodwill, maybe in their will when the owner dies, whatever the case is, when the owner frees the slave under certain conditions, the slave actually becomes a Roman citizen. And so we see there a direct parallel to the law in Jewish law, where a non-Jewish slave becomes a full citizen, meaning a full Jew, upon becoming freed. So this would have made eminent sense to the rabbis living in under Roman law, and maybe a good example of a kind of dina de malchuta dina of a Jewish law working in parallel to Roman law. All right, Rabbi Chia bar Abba ikla legabla. Now we have a story about Rabbi Chia. He went to the city up in Golan called Gavla. Chaza benot Yisrael demi aberan migerim shemalu velo tablu. And he saw the citizens there were not keeping all the details of halacha 100%. This is fascinating in and of itself, because very often we know about the rabbis and we know what they were doing, and they were keeping everything, but we don't have that much information about just common Jews, regular people. Like today, you have common Jews that keep holidays but don't keep other things, and how was Judaism actually practiced? So this is a place that's far away, not in the middle, not the center of town in Jerusalem or Tiberias, which were important cities and rabbis were dominant figures there, but this place up in the Golan, where there's a Jewish community that has identity, but what were they keeping, what were they not keeping? So Rabbi Chia reports that the Jewish woman there would become pregnant from gerim, from half converts who did brit milah but did not immerse. We're going to see in a few minutes that there is an opinion in halacha that a non-Jewish man who gets brit milah, even though he doesn't convert, even though he doesn't immerse, is a valid convert. So they do have something to rely on here, even though it's not halacha today and was not agreed upon by all back then. Okay, so they're doing this somewhat valid practice, and also v'chazach hamra de Yisrael de mazge goyim v'shetu Yisrael. They saw there was wine of Jews, so it's kosher wine, but non-Jews were pouring it for them, and the Jews were drinking it. So this is not yayin nesech, it's not non-Jewish wine that the non-Jew is using for idolatry. It's Jewish wine, but the non-Jew is pouring it, so it's kind of a borderline case, if that's permitted or not. And he furthermore saw lupins. This is plant here that has seeds that look like this, and these lupins would be cooked by non-Jews, and then the Jews would eat them. And this we'll discuss may be a problem of bishul goyim. Anyway, Rabbi Chia did not say anything to them, right? So he wanted to get advice first. Atale kamed Rabbi Yochanan amar le se ve'achreza benehem shehem mamzerim val yenam mishum yen nesech val turmasan mishum bishul goyim lefi shanan bnei Torah. Rabbi Yochanan was very strict and said, go and tell them, announce that their children, the children of these unions between the Jewish woman and these half-converted non-Jews who did Brit Milah but did not immerse, that their children are mamzerim. Okay, this is Rabbi Yochanan, who was very strict about these, as we saw yesterday. And go tell them that the wine that they are drinking is the same as wine for idolatrous libation, even though the non-Jews only poured it. And go tell them that these lupin dishes are prohibited because they are cooked by non-Jews. Now, why is he so strict to them, even though we're going to see in a second that some of these things are actually justifiable? The reason why he was so strict is because they are not knowledgeable of Torah in that place. And so, ironically, right, paradoxically, you have to be more strict with those who know less Torah. If someone knows a lot of Torah, then they know how to make fine distinctions, and this is allowed, this is not allowed, and you don't have to worry that it's going to come to other prohibitions or to laxity in general. But these people, because they're not knowledgeable, and you're going to allow them this, and then they're going to allow the next thing, and so we have to be even stricter with the people in Gavla who are not so educated and not so careful. Okay, let's analyze each case. Al benehen shen mamzerin. Rabbi Yochanan letamed Rabbi Yechia bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan leolam en ger ad shemol v'yitbol ve'kevan de lo tabal goy hu. So Rabbi Yochanan is actually following his own opinion. There's not even a stringency for him. He would say this even for Bnei Torah, because he says that a convert is not a convert until he does both Brit Milah and goes to the mikveh. We're going to see machloket about this in a minute. And since these men did not go to mikveh, they are simply non-Jews. And furthermore, Rabbi Yochanan, we saw him quoted yesterday, was one of the strict Amoraim, and he said a non-Jew who has a union with a Jewish woman, the child is a mamzer, right? Because Rabbi Yochanan is strict about that. And so therefore, not only is the conversion is not good, therefore the father is not Jewish, and he thinks that a father who is not Jewish produces a mamzer. That's number one. Their children are mamzerim. Mishum lech amrin nezira sechor sechor lechalma latikrav. Regarding Yain Nesech, even though technically the idolater did not pour this wine for idolatry, it's Jewish wine, it was produced by Jews, nevertheless, we take an example from a Nazir. A Nazir is not allowed to drink, to have wine or grapes, but he's allowed, technically, to walk through a vineyard. But nevertheless, we tell him, hey, go around the vineyard. Don't even go close to it, because then you're going to go through it, you're going to be tempted, so stay away from it. So too here, while only idolatrous wine is technically prohibited, nevertheless, Rabbi Yochanan wanted them to stay away from it further and not let the non-Jew even pour the kosher Jewish wine, lest it come to actually having non-kosher wine. So, and also the lupins, he prohibited to them only because they were not educated in Torah. So we ask about that. And so if they were educated, if they were Talmidei Chachamim, then they would be permitted to eat these non-Jewishly cooked lupins. V'amar Rav Shemuel bar Yaakov bar Rav Yitzchak mishmei derav kol nechal kemot shehu chai en bo mishum bishulei goyim v'ha turmus eno nechal kemot shehu chai v'yesh bo mishum bishulei goyim. Why would it be allowed for Torah scholars? After all, the name of Rav was taught that the rule is anything that can be eaten raw, we do not apply bishul goyim. If you have carrots can be eaten raw, and therefore even if a non-Jew cooks it, it's still permitted because you could have eaten it raw. But lupins cannot be eaten raw, and therefore they should be prohibited as bishul goyim even to Talmidei Chachamim. So why was Rabbi Yochanan so strict about it? Rabbi Yochanan kedi idach lishana sevira le'edamar Rav Shemuel bar Rav Yitzchak mishmei derav. So Rabbi Yochanan was following a different version of Rav's statement, who made a different limitation on the word on bishul goyim. Kol she'en ole al shulchan melachim le'echol bo et hapat en bo mishum bishulei goyim. Rav in a different version said anything that does not go on the table of kings to be eaten together with the bread, as a side dish with the bread, it does not fall under the category of bishul goyim. In other words, only fancy dishes that a king would eat, there the prohibition is a bishul goyim. And these lupins are not fancy. And that's why, if it was a Tamid Chacham, you'd say lupins are just plain old seeds, not such an important dish, and therefore, even though they can't be eaten raw, since it's not an important dish, there's no problem of bishul goyim. So that would be true if they were bnei Torah. V'tama de'enan bnei Torah, ha bnei Torah shareh. And so the only reason why Rabbi Yochanan prohibited it to them in this case is because they were not bnei Torah. If it had been bnei Torah, then he would have permitted it. And so that is the distinction. This is a very important halacha l'maaseh regarding bishul goyim, where both of these conditions do need to be met halacha l'maaseh in order to be a problem of bishul goyim. We now come to an extremely central sugya, from which we learn the very basics of what it means to convert. In order to convert, as we know, for a man requires brit milah and mikveh, for a woman just mikveh. How do we know this? Where does it say this anywhere in the Torah? Well, the rabbis here are going to derive it from Yetziat Mitzrayim. Before Matan Torah, there was a family, but they were not officially Jewish. In other words, they were not did not commit themselves to the Brit. Right? Essentially, to convert to Judaism means it's not a race or a lineage or a genetic or anything like that, but rather is a commitment to the legal system of the Torah, entering into the Brit and agreeing to it. So Bnei Yisrael do that as a whole at Har Sinai. That's when all of the nation converts themselves. They enter into the Brit. So we'll analyze what did they do? What did the Avot and the Imahot do during the process between Yetziat Mitzrayim and Har Sinai, and from that we will derive the general law for individuals forever after who want to come join the Brit will have to do something similar. Okay, so we have a Braita with three opinions. Tenor Banan, Ger Shemal Velo Taval. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Hareze Ger. According to Rabbi Eliezer, a convert, a male, requires only Brit Milah, does not require Tevilah. How does he know? Sheken Masinu Bavotenu Shemalu Velo Tavlu. We find our forefathers did Brit Milah and not Tevilah. So forefathers here refers not only to Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, who did Brit Milah, and that was the basis of the Brit back then, but actually refers more importantly to the generation of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Now, the Torah does not say explicitly that they did Brit Milah when they left Egypt, but we can infer it from the fact that they did Korban Pesach, and there's a general rule that in order to eat Korban Pesach, one has to do Brit Milah first, and certainly they had a concept of Brit Milah from Abraham, and so therefore he assumes that they did Brit Milah. It does not say that they did Tevilah, and yet they were able to eat from Korban Pesach, and that's all they did. So only Brit Milah is necessary. Tabal velo mal. What if one did only Tevilah and not Brit Milah? Rabbi Yoshua Omer Hareze Ger Shekem Masinu Ba'imahot Shetablu velo malum. Rabbi Yoshua says that also, that is fine, just Tevilah, because look at the four mothers, the women who left Mitzrayim. Obviously, they didn't do Brit Milah, but they must have done Tevilah. Again, it doesn't say that explicitly. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So, according to Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, one needs one or the other. Chachamim omerim tabal velo mal, ma velo tabal, and ged ad shimol v'yitbol. However, the majority view is that if you did only one or the other, it's not good. One is not a convert until, if he's for a man, Brit Milah and Tevilah, for a woman, Tevilah is necessary. Okay, good. So now we have the three opinions. Let's analyze them. Rabbi Yoshua namen elef me'avot. How come Rabbi Yoshua doesn't learn from the avot? And since they did Brit Milah and say Brit Milah is necessary. But Rabbi Eliezer namen elef me'avot, and Rabbi Eliezer, who said you don't need Tevilah, why did he say that? Why doesn't he learn from the mothers, from the woman who only had Tevilah, and say that that's necessary? So first we'll address Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer could say you can't derive a law from an impossibility to a possibility. In other words, for a man to convert, he says you need Brit Milah. What are you going to tell me? But the woman didn't do Brit Milah and they were converted just with Tevilah. Therefore, men also should just only have Tevilah. No, that's not a good argument. For women, it's impossible for them to get Brit Milah. Just physically impossible. There's no such concept, no mitzvah. And therefore, for women, they could do Tevilah because that's what's possible for them. You can't use that as a proof for men where it is possible to do Tevilah. So Rabbi Eliezer could have an answer like that. However, we're going to show that he cannot use that answer because in another case, he rejects that very type of logic. V'atanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer, minayin lepesach dorot she'en ba אלא מן החולין, נאמר פסח במצרים ונאמר פסח בדורות. מה פסח אמור במצרים? אין בא אלא מן החולין, אף פסח אמור לדורות, אין בא אלא מן החולין. So his question is, how do we know that in order to acquire an animal for Korban Pesach in future generations, you have to use holin money, as opposed to Maaser Sheni money. Maaser Sheni, that is that the farmer would have to bring to Jerusalem, and he can redeem it for money and bring it to Jerusalem and buy things there. Maaser Sheni money has to be used for food, and the question is, can you use Maaser Sheni money in order to buy the animal for Korban Pesach? That way you can save money. Rabbi Eliezer says no. It has to be from non-sacred money. How does he know that? Because we're going to compare the very first Korban Pesach that was done in Egypt with the future Korban Pesach that's done in all generations. Just like in Egypt, they bought it from non-consecrated money. How do we know that? Well, they didn't have Maaser Sheni. They didn't get the Torah yet. They didn't have farms. So they didn't have anything about Maaser Sheni. So obviously they just used their regular money that they had, perhaps that they got from the Egyptian neighbors. And so too, for all generations, that we learn one has to bring regular non-sacred money in order to buy the Korban Pesach. Okay, so that's Rabbi Eliezer's proof. Amad le Rabbi Akiva v'chi danin efshar mishei efshar. Rabbi Akiva says that's not a good proof. You can't derive a place that was impossible to a place where it is possible. In Egypt, they didn't have maaser sheni money, so it was impossible. Of course, they had to use non-sacred money. But perhaps if they had it, maybe they could have. So we can't. That's not a good proof to a case where it is possible. So Rabbi Akiva is the one now using this methodology. Rabbi Eliezer said, even though it was impossible then, nevertheless, the fact is that they used non-sacred money, and therefore it's a good proof. And so you see, Rabbi Eliezer in general has no problem learning from an impossible to a possible case, and therefore he should have no problem learning from the fact that women do not require Brit Milah and only Tevilah. Therefore, we should learn that men also do not require Brit Milah but only Tevilah to convert. So we're back to our question against him. Rather, you know what? Actually, if someone did Tevilah only without Brit Milah, you're right indeed. Everyone agrees. Even Rabbi Eliezer agrees that that's fine, right? And we can learn it from the Imahot, Tevilah. They only had Tevilah. Men also only require Tevilah. So that's agreed upon. Ki piligi b'mal velo taval, Rabbi Eliezer elif me'avot, Rabbi Yoshua be'avot name Tevilah hava. What they're arguing is about the other case where a man had only Brit Milah, but not Tevilah. Rabbi Eliezer says, the Avot, we know they did Brit Milah because they had Korban Pesach, but it doesn't say anywhere that they did Tevilah, so that's sufficient. Whereas Rabbi Yoshua said, no, the Avot also did Tevilah, and therefore both are required. Rabbi Eliezer says only Brit Milah is required. Rabbi Eliezer therefore would say either Brit Milah or Tevilah would be sufficient. Rabbi Yoshua said you definitely need Tevilah. Brit Milah is by itself is not enough. Okay, minale. Now, how does Rabbi Eliezer know that Tevilah was done? Perhaps it's the 3 days before Matan Torah. Hashem told Moshe to go tell the people, go and sanctify yourselves today and tomorrow and wash your garments. So sanctify themselves, meaning they would stay away from their wives, but wash their garments. So in a mikveh, we assume. Now, in general, there are various types of tum'ah in which one's clothing will not require washing, even though his body will require tevilah in a mikveh. So if in a place where it's possible that his clothing does not, and yet the body does, makom shetaun kibus, then in a case where one's clothing, a type of tumah that is even more stringent and requires the clothing to go to mikveh, all the more so that the person will require going to the mikveh. The point is that if Moshe told them, go and put your clothing in a mikveh, then all the more so they themselves went into a mikveh, right? It's not just saying that only their clothing and not them. So if they are tameh and have to become tahor, so we see that they went to a mikveh. They themselves before Matan Torah, and that was part of a conversion process. But we reject that. Maybe it's just to become clean. Go wash your clothes. Take it to the dry cleaner, iron them. You have to look nice for this special day. It's like a wedding day, and maybe it has nothing to do with going in a mikveh. All right, so that's not a good proof. Rather, it's from the berit ceremony that is done. Right there at the end of Mishpatim, it's recorded. Moshe took the blood and sprinkled it upon the people. This is a Brit ceremony, kind of like with Brit B'nai Betarim, that you split the animal and go through. So here it's part of you take the blood and split the blood into two parts, and part of it goes on the Mizbeach and part of it goes on the nation, and therefore this is a blood covenant. And we learned that you can't do haza'ah unless there is immersion first. And so therefore we can assume that they did immersion in the mikveh before they did this ceremony. Okay. So although it is not explicit, Rabbi Yoshua infers that tevilah was done, and that is to the men. Okay, but how about the women, right? Where does it say that they did tevilah? He ends up saying it's just logical, because otherwise, what did they do to enter into the divine presence? Okay, so it's a bit circular, this reasoning. They must have done, in order to convert to Judaism, you must go to the mikveh. How do you know? Well, because the woman back then entered into the berit. How could they have done it without brit milah? Without mikveh? So they must have gone to the mikveh. Okay, his point is that you have to do something in order to enter it, and so this is the most logical choice. Anyway, that's Rabbi Yoshua's assumption. And that's how we know that, yes, mikveh is the necessary requirement, according to Rabbi Yoshua, for men and women. Amar Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, le'olam eno ger ad sheyimol vitbol. And so now, for halacha l'maaseh, Rabbi Yochanan says, like Chachamim said in the Baraita, you need both Brit Milah and Mikveh. So we ask, B'shita Yachid v'Rabim halacha k'Rabim. Isn't this obvious? We have two minority opinions and we have a majority opinion. So obviously it's going to be like the majority opinion that requires both. Why do you even need to say this? Oh, here's the answer. Man chachamim Rabbi Yoseh. We're going to show in the Baraita right now that the opinion that says you require both in this Baraita is the opinion of Rabbi Yoseh. So since in the Baraita it's only a minority opinion, that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi that in the Baraita is recorded as a majority opinion, but we know in its origin it is in fact a minority opinion. So that's why Rabbi Yochanan needs to tell us that it is in fact halacha l'maaseh, because you might have said, well, it is also recorded as a minority opinion in the following Baraita. Okay, but this will be the halacha, and so let's look at the Baraita. The Tanya hare sheba ve'amar malti ve'lo tabalti matbilin oto uma bekach divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Someone comes to a bet din and says, listen, I did brit milah outside of betin, whatever the circumstances, I did it, but I didn't go into the mikveh. So, according to the Yehuda, so let him go to the mikveh, and what's the problem? In other words, according to him, even though the brit milah may have been done with not for the sake of conversion, it's okay, right? He'll do tevilah in front of us for the sake of conversion, and that is sufficient. Rabbi Yoseh Omer and matbilin. Rabbi Yoseh is more stringent, and he said, wait, the brit milah was not done under supervision to make sure that it was part of the conversion process. Well, then that's no good, not good. Then you can't just go ahead and do tevilah. You got to do the whole process over again. So we see here that Rabbi Yoseh requires both brit milah and tevilah, and both have to be done properly for the sake of conversion. The Baraita continues and says, "Lefichach matbilin ger b'Shabbat dibrei Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Yoseh Omer en matbilin." So we say, therefore, one can do tevilah for a convert even on Shabbat, assuming that this convert already did Brit Milah and did it properly for the sake of conversion. So therefore, according to the Yehuda, only one is necessary. So since only one is necessary, he is already a convert. And if he comes and wants to do Tevilah on Shabbat, we let him, because the Tevilah is not actually necessary. Okay, there's another law. You cannot fix something on Shabbat and make it go from unusable to usable. And this applies also to a person who is Tameh. You cannot become tahor on Shabbat, and someone who is not Jewish cannot convert on Shabbat because he's changing his status, being repaired, so to speak. But Rabbi Yehuda says this is okay because he already did Brit Milah properly, and therefore this tevilah is just optional. He can do it on Shabbat. Rabbi Yoseh Omer and matbilin. Rabbi Yoseh, on the other hand, says no, you cannot do tevilah on Shabbat, even if you already did Brit Milah properly. Rabbi Yoseh requires both, and so that tevilah would be the clincher, the makeh patish, that would make him Jewish, and therefore cannot be done on Shabbat. Okay, that is the Baraita. We're just going to analyze this part of the Baraita, make explicit what we've already explained. Amar mor lefichach matbilin ger b'Shabbat. Pishita. This first statement of Rabbi Yehuda that non-Jew can do tevilah on Shabbat. Isn't this obvious? Kevan damar Rabbi Yehuda b'chada sagya hecha demalu lefanin matbilin my lefichach. Since Rabbi Yehuda says you only need to do one brit milah or tevilah, and he already did the brit milah in front of us, since we know it was proper. So then he doesn't matbilin. Then he doesn't need the conversion, the immersion as well. And so for sure you could do that on Shabbat. So why say lefichach? Why do we even need this whole thing? And the answer is from the first clause of the Baraita up here. I might have thought that tevilah is the main thing. And he comes and says, I did Brit Milah, and says, Lo Tavalti, so then he has to do Tevilah. He'll do Tevilah in front of us, because Brit Milah doesn't matter. The Tevilah is necessary. We might have thought that that's what he thinks. And therefore, even if he did Brit Milah before, and he comes and do Tevilah on Shabbat, we might tell him no, because Tevilah is what makes you Jewish. And that's fixing him. So there's the word, this clause, lefichach, teaches us not so. Rabbi Yehuda thinks that you need either tevilah or brit milah, and because in the second clause he had brit milah and not tevilah, it's good enough, and he can do it. He can go to the mikveh on Shabbat. And now a similar question to Rabbi Yosef, Omer en matbilin pishita. Isn't that also obvious according to his logic? Since Rabbi Yosef says you need both brit milah and tevilah, so isn't that obvious that he can't do brit milah, he can't do the tevilah on Shabbat, because then he is becoming fixed. No, we might have thought that according to Rabbi Yosef, really Brit Milah is the main thing. And in the first clause, the first clause, the Brit Milah was not in front of us, and so we don't know if it was done properly for the sake of conversion. And that's why he said, no good, you can't come back. You have to do Brit Milah again. You can't just do Tevilah now. But perhaps Rabbi Yosef would say, if the Brit Milah was done properly, then that's sufficient. And therefore you can do Brit Milah on Shabbat because it's not affecting anything. So we need the second clause to teach that Rabbi Yosef actually requires both. Alright, so this concludes the proof that the opinion of Chachamim in the previous Baraita that says you need both is in fact the opinion of the minority opinion of individual opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Nevertheless, halacha is decided like him. And we're going to see from one more story here what the halacha is, and it's going to add another couple of important items. Amar Rabba, Ovada hava be Rabbi Chiya bar Rabbi. There was an incident, a conversion that happened in the house of Rabbi Chiya, the son of Rabbi. But Rav Yosef matne Rabbi Oshaya bar Rabbi. Rav Yosef says, you know who was also there? Rabbi Oshaya, the son of Rabbi. Rav Safra matne Rav Safra, the Amora, adds, matne Rabbi Oshaya be Rabbi Chiya, that another Rabbi Oshaya, the son of Rabbi Chiya, was also there. So altogether there are now 3 sages that were present, according to all of these testimonies. And such a case happened of a convert who did Brit Milah but not mikveh. What did they tell him? Amar le shehikan ad machar venat beli nach. This is stay here. Apparently he came at night, and he said, listen, stay here until tomorrow, and we'll give you Brit Milah, we'll do mikveh, rather, and then you'll be a good kosher convert. So that's the story. Shema mina telat. We can learn 3 things from this story. Shema mina ger sarich shelosha. Number 1, since there were 3 sages there, and the rabbis go out of their way to make a point that all 3 were there, it means that you need a bet din of 3 people to preside over a conversion. Right? They have to be there. It's a good question. What do they need to be there for? Are they there to ask him, do you commit yourself to all the mitzvot, including the rewards and punishment? And he has to say yes in front of them. Is it that? Is that the main thing? Or is it that they have to be there for the immersion in the mikveh and testify that it happened? These are important questions. Exactly which part of it they need to be there. They're important questions because how do you convert a woman, right? If it's just that they have to interview the woman and say yes, and she agrees that to be obligated mitzvot, and then goes to the mikveh afterwards, then that's simple. But if and that's all seems according to this. Rambam, however, says that the judges actually have to be present during the mikveh, and that leads to a problem. How do you do that while maintaining siniut? So generally, the judges will just be in an outside the door in a room next door. They don't have to actually see anything. Okay. Anyway, so we do learn from here that we require 3 people as judges. Also, even though he did brit milah, we assume he did it properly, and nevertheless, that's not enough. He has to do tevilah also. We also learn that we don't allow a conversion mikveh at night. That's why he told him to wait during the day, wait till the daytime. Okay. Why don't we say that we learn yet another law here, that the 3 people that are there for the Bet Din have to be experts, because after all, look at the stature of these 3 sages. Maybe they'll have to be of great stature. And I say, no, not necessarily. Maybe this happened to be that they were 3 great rabbis that were there together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be that way. Even if you have some of the judges who are laymen, then it would still be a proper Bet Din, and that conversion would still be a valid conversion, even if they weren't all 3 great sages. We now conclude with the source for this law that you need a Bet Din of 3 sages. Amar Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ger Sarich Shelosha Mishpat Ketiv Be. In order to convert, you are required to have 3 people as judges, because the pasuk says Mishpat, that Mishpat Echad Yelachem Velager. There's one law. Literally, it means one law for you and for Gerim. The law, one law applies to both. But since it does say the word Mishpat regarding Gerim, so Rabbi Yochanan learns from this that we require a Mishpat, we require a Bet Din in order to become a convert. And this is, I think, very nicely conceptualizes what it means to convert, that this is not simply a holy ritual, but rather a legal procedure. It's a legally binding procedure, just like one can enter into a contract or something and legally binds himself or herself, so too conversion, as it was at Har Sinai, was a legally binding berit. It says we accept this upon ourselves with all the conditions attached. So too every convert that enters the Jewish people enters into a legally binding agreement to observe the mitzvot, and that explains why it's not just about testimony. That would just require 2 people to see that they did, to verify that yes, you did brit milah, verify this, you did mikveh. It's not about verification only, but more importantly about the legal declaration that creates the binding agreement as the ger now enters into the berit and becomes part of the Jewish people. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.